A mute girl fell into a muddy pit in the middle of a rain-drenched forest, unable to cry for help unheard by anyone. And then, the unimaginable happened. A wild lion appeared, leapt into the ravine, and pulled the child from the depths of silent despair. The story sent shockwaves through the village. But what chilled people the most wasn't the rescue itself. It was what came after, when the lion stood in front of the girl, shielding her, facing the barrel of a gun, pointed straight at its head. No roar, no retreat, just a quiet stare. And in that gaze, even the hardest hearts fell silent. The school drum echoed across the dusty courtyard, bouncing off the sun-baked clay walls of a small village nestled beside a wildlife preserve in Africa. Children burst out like a flock of startled birds, shouting, laughing, singing, kicking up clouds of red dust beneath the blazing sun. The whole world buzzed with life, except for one still corner beneath the shade of an old baobab tree. There a little girl sat curled up, her dress stained with dirt, clutching a torn sketchbook. Her eyes met no one's. She didn't flinch when a ball rolled past her feet. Just that faraway stare, and a silence that felt louder than all the noise. Not everyone who stays quiet in a crowd does so because they have nothing to say. Lily, age 9, hadn't spoken a word in 2 years. Not since the night her house went up in flames and her mother never made it out. Doctors called it selective mutism from trauma. But in the village, no one cared for medical terms. They just saw a child who didn't speak, didn't play, didn't smile, a wandering silence in a world that never stopped shouting. Kids called her forest ghost. Some even growled like animals to tease her. Lily never reacted. She just held her sketchbook tighter, where she drew elephants, birds, and lions, as if speaking to them through the strokes of her pencil. Some children don't search for a place in the crowd because they already lost everything in the quiet. Her father Daniel still cooked for her. Each night, asked gentle questions, rested his hand on her shoulder before bed. Lily never answered. But that evening, she placed a drawing on the table, a baby elephant crying. Not everyone who stays silent is weak. Sometimes silence is the last way to survive. That afternoon, the sky was still so still it seemed to swallow every sound. Lily didn't go straight home after school. Instead, she wandered along the edge of the forest where thick roots stretched across the dusty path and sunlight pierced through the leaves in scattered beams. There she felt at peace. No staring eyes, no mocking laughter, just the wind and the scent of dry leaves. A sudden movement caught her eye. A sparrow fell into the grass, wings limp, flapping weakly, before tumbling onto brittle twigs. Lily crept after it, clutching her tattered sketchbook, her heart beating quietly, as if sharing the small creature's pain. Perhaps only those who have known pain can recognize it in others. She didn't notice she had crossed the red rock boundary the line villagers only whispered about, calling it with trembling voices the cursed forest. The trees grew taller here. The light turned pale and cold. No birds sang. No wind blew. Only the sound of her own footsteps, and her heart beat loud like it might choke her. They said this place was cursed, but what words could hurt more than the ones the living say to each other? Then she stopped. In the narrow clearing ahead, a male lion lay collapsed beside a rotting tree stump. One leg trapped in a rusted steel snare, dried blood caked around the paw flies, buzzing in clusters. It panted hard, its eyes not frantic, but filled with exhaustion too deep to name. Lily froze. She didn't scream, didn't run. She looked into its eyes and saw herself a creature imprisoned, silent, unheard. For the first time in 2 years, her heart beat not from fear, but from the urge to do something. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a worn scarf, and slowly knelt. The lion growled low, its fur bristling, but it didn't rise. The space between girl and beast shrank not through words, but through a gaze that did not flinch. When the world turns its back on a creature, sometimes a fearless glance is a kind of salvation. Part 3. Healing Without Words. The next morning, Lily quietly tucked a small piece of raw meat into her cloth bag stolen from her father's fridge. She left the house before the sun had touched the thatched rooftops, her footsteps soft, as if afraid to shatter something fragile. By the time she reached the forbidden forest, the light had turned amber, filtering through the trees like a delicate veil of dusk. The lion was still there, its breathing, labored eyes half shut. Lily placed the meat a few steps away, then sat back. No touching, no calling, just waiting. She didn't know how much longer it would live, only that she couldn't bear not to come back. In the days that followed, that walk became a ritual. Every afternoon, rain or shine, Lily returned. She brought damp cloths, strips of worn fabric, scraps of food. She dipped the cloth into the stream, wiped away the dried blood, and gently cleaned the festering wounds. At first, the lion growled softly when she touched him, a reflex of old instincts. But slowly he stopped resisting. He just closed his eyes, allowing her small hands to reach a pain no one else had dared approach. One day, the rain poured down in sheets. Lily still came, soaked to the skin, lips tinged blue from the cold, but her eyes never left him. When no one had ever taught her how to love, it was a wild animal that showed her how. By the 8th day, when Lily stepped out from the tree line, the lion no longer faced away. He lifted his head, looked straight at her. There was no fear in his eyes, only something that felt like waiting. She knelt down and touched his leg just as she always did. This time he didn't flinch. He tilted his head slightly as if exhaling in relief. Under the fading golden light spilling through the branches, she sat beside him. No extra touches, no actions. Just sitting as two souls once shattered quietly began to piece themselves back together. They both bore wounds. And perhaps that's why they could see each other so clearly. Sometimes just staying beside someone and not leaving is enough to heal. Part 4. Disappearance without goodbye. That afternoon, like every other, Lily quietly made her way into the forest with her small bag. But when she reached the familiar tree, it was empty. No lion, no paw prints, no blood, no chewed bandages. Only the faintly flattened grass, as if a creature had once lain there and slipped back into the forest without a trace. She came back the next day, and the day after, at sunrise, at dusk. Still nothing but silence. Lily didn't cry. That night she sat before her bedroom wall and drew a large circle in chalk. Inside it she shaded 2 golden dots round deep still. When we can't name something, we often try to keep it by turning it into an image. From that day on, the lion appeared everywhere, not in flesh, but in sketches and memory. She drew him in the margins of her workbook, on the wooden desk in class, on the fogged window pane of her bedroom. Sometimes just a stroke of the mane. Sometimes the front leg with the scar. Her teacher watched with growing concern. Her father grew quieter at the dinner table, and the other kids giggled behind her back, the mute girls making up stories again, pretending she has a friend. One day, a boy ripped one of her drawings. The paper drifted to the floor and spun away in the wind. Lily bent down, picked it up, and without a word, redrew the exact same image in charcoal on the desk. No protest, no tears. When something important leaves us, we hold on to it with the same thing that once connected us: silence. Her father caught her once. He asked gently, "You still go into the forest?" Lily nodded. Daniel sighed, believing she was chasing echoes of her late mother through imagination. But Lily didn't need anyone to understand. That night she drew on a large board a little girl sitting in the forest beside a massive, nameless creature, bowing its head toward her. No colors, no words, just presence. Not everyone needs to be understood. Some friendships are meant only to be felt. The truest friendships are the ones that never need to be proven. Part 5. Forest Rain and the Pit. Below. That afternoon, dark clouds swept in like a waterfall. Wind howled through the trees like voices calling from a distant place. The air grew heavy, damp, and hushed. Lily was sitting alone at the edge of the village where the forest met the red dust fields when suddenly a baby elephant stumbled past her. Blood trickled from its hind leg, leaving scattered red drops on the wet earth. She didn't stop to think. She didn't call for help. She wasn't wearing shoes. She just stood and ran pure instinct. In that moment, she forgot she was the silent girl, and only remembered she had once saved another living thing. The rain came fast, like the forest was trying to trap something inside. The ground turned to mush. Tree roots jutted out like twisted arms from below. Lily stepped on a rotted root, slipped, and fell. Her small body plunged into a muddy crevice, its walls slick with clay. She landed hard on her knees. A sharp pain shot through her leg, blood soaked through the thin fabric. She tried to stand grabbing at roots and rocks, but every time she climbed a few inches, the wall gave way. She opened her mouth, but like all the times before, no sound came out. Just ragged breath and the relentless drum of rain on leaves above. In the heart of the forest, a silent scream from a child can disappear as if it never existed. Night fell quickly. Insects buzzed thick around the narrow pit, their sound like a swarm closing in. Lily curled up, trembling, freezing. She hugged her knees, mud, blood, and fear mixing into something she couldn't name. She thought of her father still waiting for dinner. She thought of her mother who had vanished into the fire. And then she thought of those golden eyes watching her once quiet and unafraid. Her own eyes, wide and tearful, gazed up at the misty sky. That look was the only cry she had left. Not all cries have to come from the mouth. Some call out from the eyes and reach straight into the heart. Suddenly, something shifted. The sound of rain faded beneath a new rhythm, a deep, steady thudding like heavy footsteps pressing through wet earth. Birds shrieked and fell silent. The wind curled backward, carrying with it a strange warmth in the middle of the cold night. A breeze brushed against Lily's cheek, not sharp, but soft, like the breath of someone who had once been near. She opened her eyes wide, held her breath. It felt like something was coming, something enormous and familiar. In the silence of the wild, fear can become the loudest sound of all. Part 6. The Roar in the Rain. The rain kept pouring as if daring the earth to endure more. The muddy pit had turned into a cold, waterlogged cradle. Lily lay motionless, her clothes soaked and clinging to her skin, her hair matted to her forehead, heavy with rain. The cold had seeped from bone to skin and from skin to heart. She no longer shivered. She could no longer lift her arms. Her eyes were barely open, not from sleep, but because they simply couldn't stay open any longer. Her chest rose and fell with only the faintest effort. Above her, the tree limbs shuddered. Wind cut through the narrow gap like distant howling. Rain pounded down like the steady fist of fate. Silence was no longer a choice, it had become the final symptom of exhaustion. And then a roar tore through the night sky. It wasn't thunder from above. It came from beneath, from the earth itself, rattling through the soil, through her limbs, through her blood. Lily blinked. She knew that sound. She'd heard it once on a silent afternoon with blood on the ground and a rusted trap. She pried her eyes open, blurred through the curtain of rain, and saw it. A large figure, dark and soaked with a mane heavy and tangled, stood at the edge of the pit. Its eyes burned like twin embers in the night, not fierce, but proud. It didn't come to hunt. It came to reclaim something that had once touched its wild heart. The lion no longer roared. It stepped cautiously to the pit's edge, exhaled short bursts of breath, and gave a soft growl a signal. Without hesitation, it began to dig. Claws scooped into the wet earth, pulling back layers of mud, carving a narrow path downward. It slid partway into the pit, braced its body against the slope, and lowered its head toward Lily. Its mane brushed against her cheek, warm, heavy reel like an embrace made of fur. Lily, though barely able to move, reached out. Her fingers gripped the tangled mane and held on as if she'd finally found the end of her fall. The lion inched backward, pulling her gently with each strained movement. Its shoulders flexed with every retreat. Mud slid. Wind lashed. But neither let go. One couldn't call for help. The other had no words. But both understood. No one would be left behind. No one teaches the wild to be grateful unless they've known kindness before. At last her small body reached the rim of the pit. Lily collapsed her hand, still clutching the lion's mane as if afraid it might vanish like a dream. The lion stood still, panting, its eyes locked on hers, unmoving. In the steady rhythm of the falling rain, their eyes met no words, no tears. In a world that had once gone silent to her for the first time, a creature had stood up and roared on her behalf. Not all wild things are to be feared. Some come to roar for those who've been forgotten. Flashlights sliced through the thick curtain of rain. Voices echoed through the forest, pulsing like anxious heartbeats. Lily, is anyone there? Lily boots pounded against the slick ground. Weapons clinked. Radio chatter crackled with urgency, and then everything stopped. What the rescue team saw was something no one could have imagined. A small girl soaked through her hand, still gripping the mane of a massive male lion. The beast, standing tall, body arched over her like a shield of flesh and blood. No growling, no attack. Just stillness, quiet, deliberate. No one believed what they saw until silence itself made them take a step back. A shout rang out, "Lion." Then the click of a safety being released. A red laser dot danced across the lion's forehead. Its muscles tightened. Amber eyes stared out, not angry, but confused. Lost. Lily still stood behind it, trembling not from fear of the lion, but because she could feel its fear. The lion's gaze swept the crowd, not hunting, but searching for a way out. For the first time in her life, she wasn't listening with her ears, but with the scars of another. Without hesitation, Lily stepped forward, small barefoot exposed in the downpour. Someone yelled, "Get back!" The girl's being used as a shield. She didn't stop. She didn't look at them. Her arms stretched wide, her legs muddy but steady. Her lips moved, as if she'd never been taught how to shape sound. Then a voice broke through the rain, rough, raw, tearing the silence. "Don't shoot!" Everything froze. The man with the rifle stood stunned. A woman covered her mouth in disbelief. Someone dropped a flashlight. The rain kept falling, but every other sound disappeared. It was as if the whole world held its breath for a voice reborn after 3 years of silence. Lily's throat burned, but her heart pounded, not from fear, but from something deeper. She could finally protect the one who had once protected her. A voice doesn't come from the throat. It comes from a heart brave enough to open. The man slowly lowered his weapon. No one told him to. The lion stepped back, looked at her for a long moment, then turned and vanished into the forest like a shadow. No applause, no cheers, only eyes, so many eyes locked on the girl who had done the unthinkable, spoken out loud, to protect a creature the world had always feared. Her father ran to her, slipping in the mud, falling to his knees. Rain and tears mixed on his face. But Lily didn't cry. She reached for his hand, and for the first time, she was the one leading him. Strength isn't in the roar, it's in the one brave enough to use their voice to protect. Part 8. The lion left, but never far. After the roar that shook the forest, everything fell silent as if nature itself held its breath. The lion didn't look back. It simply turned step by step, deliberate, unhurried. There was no farewell roar, no rushing footsteps behind it. But each print it left on the rain-soaked earth felt like parting words, spoken without sound words, only the two of them could understand. I came when you needed me. And now, I leave my strength inside you." Lily didn't cry. She didn't call out. She just stood there, her eyes wide, not to cling, but to remember. What is wild is never ours to keep, but it can stay with us in another form for the rest of our lives. Her father lifted her as the rescue team approached. She didn't struggle, just gently held his hand like a child returning from a strange and sacred dream. The fear in her eyes had faded. Something had shifted, as if part of the darkness inside her had finally made room for a fragile light to enter. Back in the village, adults asked questions. Journalists came, took notes, snapped photos. But Lily didn't tell the story. That night, when her father asked what she wanted to name the dog she was drawing, she looked up and whispered a single word, Kio. No one knew what it meant. But Daniel did. His daughter had just given a name to something holy. From that day forward, Lily began to speak again. Not fluently, not consistently, but each word she let out was a shard of soul finding its place again. Speech doesn't return all at once, but piece by piece in time, with a heart learning to trust again. The same children who had once called her ghost of the woods now edged closer. One handed her a colored pencil. Another simply sat beside her in silence. When one finally asked, "Did you really meet a lion?" she didn't answer. She just took out a sheet of paper and drew a small girl beneath a tree beside a lion with its head bowed low. The adults stood in stillness. Lily's teacher later wrote in her journal, "Not everyone needs a doctor. Some just need a quiet soul willing to roar beside them. Some encounters don't change a child. They let the child be heard so she no longer has to stay silent." 10 years passed. The wild land, once cloaked in fear, the forbidden forest had transformed. At the edge of the reserve, where once there was only red rock and wild grass, stood a small center of wood and glass. Its name, the Silent Guardian. Its founder was a 19-year-old girl, slender and quiet, her voice low and rarely raised, but her gaze impossible to look away from. Lily. No longer the little girl huddled beneath the baobab with a sketchbook, but a young woman present every time a gazelle needed rescuing, or when a child bore the weight of invisible wounds. Not everyone who speaks loudly is a leader. Some just need to stand still in silence, and the world begins to change. In front of the center stood a statue carved from gray stone, no plaque, no artist's name. A girl sat, knees hugged to her chest, eyes distant. Beside her, a lion, not roaring, not pouncing, just bowed eyes closed as if standing guard. Visitors often paused. Someone would ask, "Is this from a children's book?" Staff would simply smile and shake their heads. You don't need to know if it's true, only believe that everyone deserves protection, even those who grew up in silence. Some stories don't need retelling because every breath here is already an echo of that story. Lily never accepted titles. She turned down international awards. Instead, she used the grant money to build outdoor classrooms for the village children, teaching them how to track animal prints, how to read the body language of wildlife, and that fear is not weakness. Whenever a child refused to speak, Lily never asked why. She simply sat beside them and quietly drew a lion in charcoal, and waited, just as someone once waited for her. On full moon nights, people often saw Lily sitting alone on the wooden porch, eyes gazing toward the forest, a place no one called forbidden anymore. She wasn't waiting for the lion to return. She was listening for a different kind of sound, the reply of memory echoing back from the heart of nature. Some choose to heal not because they've forgotten the pain, but because they've survived it. Part 10. A Whisper from the Forest's Shadow. At 21, Lily released her first book. No press tour, no book signings, no social media fanfare. The title was simple, The Forest's Shadow and the Silent Roar. Not quite a memoir, not exactly a scientific text, just fragments gathered through instinct memory and something closer to feeling than fact. No photos, No bibliography, just plain pages printed with quiet prose like the voice she had always spoken with. At her one and only public reading, she spoke softly. If you read it, take it with you into the forest. And don't expect to understand everything, because some things are meant to be felt, not explained. Some books aren't written to be sold, but to be placed in the right hands at the right time. The final page had no chapter, no acknowledgments, only a single sentence centered in the blankness. If one day deep in the woods you hear a roar that doesn't scare you, don't run, because maybe it's a thank you. Beneath the line was a rough sketch drawn by hand, a small girl standing alone in a forest path. Behind her, the blurred outline of a lion facing away, but glancing back. No signature, no certainty if the drawing was real. Some thank yous are spoken only by wind by earth and by a roar that's no longer wild. Years later, someone shared a story they had gotten lost in the forest, heart-racing panic rising when they heard a roar. Faint, not a warning, a call, and so they stopped. Not every roar is a threat. Some are how nature remembers someone who once touched its soul.